Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something slightly less mathematical, but arguably more useful if you ever find yourself without electricity, running water, or an understanding of modern plumbing: medieval survival techniques. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, possibly while hoarding beans. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world, fire wasn't a convenience, it was everything: heat, cooking, light, protection, and possibly your only friend during a week-long storm in a thatched hut. So when you left home, you didn't pack snacks, you packed fire. Enter the portable fire bundle, the medieval version of a Zippo lighter, if that lighter was slow, smelled like sheep, and could burn your entire cart down if handled badly. Here's how it worked. You'd take a glowing ember from your home hearth, typically charcoal, and wrap it inside dried moss, fungus, or punk wood, often stuffed into a hollowed-out horn or a fireproof leather pouch. Sometimes it was wrapped in linen soaked in saltpeter or animal fat for longer smoldering. The ember would smolder for hours, sometimes even an entire day, ready to be revived with a bit of breath and some gentle coaxing.
Much like your self-esteem after a peasant tax audit. The whole bundle was lightweight, reusable, and vital. It saved you from the misery of having to strike sparks from flint and steel for 30 minutes straight while pretending you knew what you were doing. Firemaking was notoriously fickle, especially if your tinder got damp or your hands were frozen into sad little claws. Carrying fire meant you could walk into a clearing, build a shelter, unpack your moss-wrapped miracle, and with a puff of breath and a prayer to Saint Smokey of the Ember, have flames ready for soup, warmth, or dramatic shadow puppet storytelling. You could even hand one to a neighbor on their way to market, passing the literal torch, because no one liked being the guy who had to beg for fire at dusk. Socially awkward and occasionally met with, "Should have packed your moss, Gerald." If you've ever looked at a prepper pantry, it's basically a museum of vacuum-sealed ambition. Jerky, beans, mystery cans from 2011, and enough freeze-dried stroganoff to survive a small apocalypse and still complain. But medieval folks, they preserved meat the old-fashioned way, with smoke, salt, and the quiet terror of having nothing to eat come February. Now, most people today think of smoking meat as something you do with a grill, a beer, and mild barbecue delusions. But in the Middle Ages, smoke wasn't for flavor, it was for survival. And not just any smoke. This was strategic, sneaky smoke, hidden smoke. You see, in many homes, especially cottages with open hearths, meat wasn't displayed or proudly above the fire like in a fantasy movie. It was hung behind the fire, tucked high up in rafters, out of reach from animals, children, and that one neighbor who always showed up at dinner. Why behind the fire? Because that's where the cool smoke drifted, slow and steady, rising through the house and wrapping itself around whatever unfortunate chicken or pig part you'd managed to obtain. Over days, weeks, and even months, the smoke would dry the meat, kill off bacteria, repel insects, and make sure your ham survived longer than your New Year's optimism. This wasn't your sweet applewood barbecue kind of smoke. This was pine and despair smoke, thick, acrid, and full of character. After a few months, the meat was hardened, darkened, and fully armed against decay, bugs, and relatives dropping in unexpectedly. Even better, hidden meat smoked slower and was harder to steal. That matters when you live in a village where "I didn't see your sausage hanging there" is somehow a legal defense. And don't forget the dual benefit. While the meat smoked, the house stayed warm and pest-resistant. Nothing says cozy medieval evening like sitting under a smoldering ham in a room filled with smoke and hope. Today's preppers love perimeter defense, motion sensors, tripwires, camera drones, and that one guy who always insists his dog can smell looters from a mile away. But medieval folks had their own version of property defense, and it didn't require batteries, barking, or Wi-Fi. It was called a living fence, And yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. Imagine trying to keep your cows in and your neighbor's children out without using lumber, nails, or yelling. The solution? Grow your wall. Living fences, also called hedgerows, were created by planting fast-growing bendy trees like willow, hawthorn, hazel, or blackthorn close together. As they grew, you didn't just let them shoot upward like overachieving weeds. No, you bent, wove, and interlaced the branches into a thick, snarling hedge that could stop a pig, redirect a goose from the porous surface. It cooled the contents, kind of like a medieval refrigerator, but cheaper, quieter, and less likely to make your leftovers taste like Freon. Some even buried clay pots in cellars or shaded pits, where the Earth's steady underground temperature helped preserve food, drinks, and sometimes Grandma's emergency apple pie. They could also be heated near a fire, then used to slowly release warmth through the night. Clay bricks were placed in beds under cloaks, or even wrapped in wool and carried on wagons. The medieval equivalent of a hot water bottle, but earthier. And unlike modern batteries, these never exploded. At worst, they just cracked and quietly gave up. If you've ever cursed at a pan because your eggs decided to permanently fuse with it, you might appreciate Teflon. But if you lived in the Middle Ages, long before non-stick coatings and late-night infomercials, you relied on something far simpler and far more blister-inducing: friction glaze. Yes, medieval folks actually polished their cookware by hand to create a smooth, semi-resistant surface that helped reduce food sticking. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't perfect, but it works surprisingly well, especially if your expectations were already shattered by a lifetime of cabbage-based disappointments. Here's how it worked. Pottery, especially cookware, was usually made of coarse clay, which is about as non-stick as sandpaper. But by rubbing the still damp pots with smooth stones, bone tools, or even hard wood, they compressed the surface, aligning particles and sealing pores. This painstaking polishing created a subtle shine known as a burnished glaze. Imagine someone spending half a day massaging a soup pot like it owes them money. That's friction glaze. Now, did this stop everything from sticking? No, this wasn't a miracle. It was medieval innovation, but it reduced food adhesion enough to make cleaning easier and stew less crusty. Some even coated their burnished pots with a thin layer of animal fat, then fired them to help seal the surface, a kind of prehistoric seasoning process. It also helped the pots last longer by making them more resistant to water and cracking. And for extra points, burnished pots look nicer. In a time when most things were gray, wooden, or dying, a shiny cooking pot was basically the medieval equivalent of kitchen bling. Of course, the process was labor-intensive and likely gave many potters permanent shoulder problems, but it meant the difference between usable cookware and a vessel that turned porridge into plaster. Modern cookers might spend hundreds on titanium cookware or whatever the latest anti-stick miracle is, but medieval folks, they sat down, grabbed a rock, and just kept rubbing until the pot obeyed. Primitive? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. Long before GPS, Google Maps, and that one friend who swears he knows a shortcut and absolutely doesn't, people had to navigate using their ears, especially in fog or forests, or those charming medieval mornings when the mist was so thick you couldn't see your own cartwheel.
5. Enter the lost art of sound navigation. Not a superpower, not echolocation by bat, but practical survival through careful listening. And frankly, we don't give our ancestors enough credit for this. These were people who could identify their village by the angle of a church bell and determine how lost they were by how many dogs were barking. Let's say you're traveling on foot. No compass, no landmarks, just fog, mud, and a deep suspicion that you're walking in circles. You tune your ears to the bells, church bells, cow bells, even strategically placed clappers or gongs in certain regions. Towns often rang their church bells, not just for mass, but as auditory lighthouses, sound that cut through the mist and reminded you that civilization still existed somewhere. Herds were often equipped with cowbells or sheep bells, not just so you could find them again when they wandered off to commit mischief, but so you could follow the noise back home, assuming you didn't follow the wrong herd and end up in Gerald's pasture again. Forests and passes sometimes had wind chimes, clanging pots or drums hung from trees to help mark trails. A clatter on the wind meant you were going the right way, or at least a way that someone had gone before and possibly survived. Fishermen used horns and echoes to find harbor entrances. Travelers would shout, clap, or bang sticks to judge distances by echo return. Primitive sonar, minus the wetsuit. Even taverns helped. Many had musicians or loud gossip that spilled into the street like a beacon of ale-fueled safety. Follow the lute, and you'd find warmth, food, and possibly your cousin passed out under a bench.
6. Teeth, using fingers, sticks, or, in the case of the particularly fashion-forward, a rag tied around a twig. This rustic blend became a sort of tooth scrub that could polish enamel, remove food buildup, and maybe, if the saints were kind, delay total tooth collapse until your 40s. Now, was it pleasant? Absolutely not. Rubbing gritty ash against your teeth feels exactly how it sounds, like chewing sand during a bonfire. But it was better than the alternative, which was to let plaque party freely until your gums staged a violent revolt. Charcoal also had mild antibacterial properties, meaning it helped fight bad breath. Sort of. Fresh breath in the medieval context meant you could speak within 3 feet of someone without causing tears. Some recipes added mint, rosemary, or sage, not for effectiveness, but for the illusion of hygiene. Others swore by vinegar rinses afterward, which likely undid any good the charcoal did and added a nice enamel melting bonus. Dental work, when things went bad, involved pliers, strong arms, and a total absence of anesthesia. So yes, smearing ashes on your molars suddenly looked like a very attractive alternative. Today, charcoal has made a comeback in hipster toothpaste and spa treatments. But let's be clear, medieval folks didn't use it to be trendy. They used it because the only other option was having your teeth pulled by a guy named Bartholomew who also sharpened knives. Let's be honest, modern housing is mostly drywall, concrete, and IKEA furniture that collapses if you even think about leaning on it wrong. But medieval peasants, they built homes out of sticks, mud, straw, and sheer optimism. The method? It was called wattle and daub, which sounds like a quirky folk band, but was actually the backbone of everyday survival architecture. Here's how it worked. First, you start with wattle, which is just a fancy word for woven branches, twigs, or long flexible sticks. Think basket weaving, but taller, colder, and way more likely to collapse on your goat. These wattle panels were then fastened between wooden posts, creating what looked like the skeleton of a very confused fence. Next came the daub, a charming hand-mixed concoction of mud, straw, clay, and animal dung. Yes, dung, because in the Middle Ages, if it wasn't at least partially made of poop, were you even trying? This delightful paste was smeared into the wattle and left to dry, forming a surprisingly strong insulated wall. It kept out the wind, held in heat, and provided the kind of rustic scent that said, "Home sweet," slightly composting home. Now, it wasn't glamorous. Your walls might occasionally crack, flake, or attract curious chickens, and patching them up was just part of your weekly to-do list, right between "don't starve" and "yell at the neighbor's goat." But it was cheap, effective, and best of all, locally sourced. No shipping fees, no carbon footprint, just earth, labor, and possibly a little trauma. Despite how primitive it sounds, wattle and daub could last decades, even centuries with maintenance. Some medieval homes still standing today have their original wattle walls, which means some peasant in 1350 did a better job than your last contractor. Picture medieval bedtime, a rickety straw mattress stuffed with regret, a thatched roof dripping something suspicious, and the constant threat of fleas, lice, and things that buzz, bite, or crawl with suspicious confidence. Enter the surprisingly elegant solution: herb-laced bedding, a rustic blend of aromatherapy and pest control. Invented not because they were fancy, but because medieval peasants didn't want to wake up as a banquet for parasites. You see, stuffing your mattress with plain straw was just asking for company, the itchy, twitchy, blood-sucking kind. So instead, smart households mixed in strong scented herbs like lavender, mint, wormwood, pennyroyal, and rosemary. Not for luxury, for defense. These herbs were nature's medieval bug spray. Their strong scents repelled fleas, lice, and mosquitoes, and occasionally your spouse. Some herbs, like tansy or rue, were even believed to keep away demons. Conveniently, they also kept away nosy in-laws. The result? A bed that smelled like a suspiciously pleasant salad and kept the crawlies at bay for a few nights at least. After that, you had to refresh the herbs or risk being scratched awake by a tick with anger management issues. It didn't stop at mattresses either. Herbs were strewn across floors, woven into door frames, and hung in bunches over beds. Basically, if you could shove a sprig of wormwood into it, you did. It turned homes into slightly terrifying apothecaries, but cleaner, safer, and better smelling than the neighbor's goat barn. In an age before bug nets and DEET, this was brilliant. Entire manuals were written on which herbs worked best. Some people even believed that dreams were sweeter when you slept on lavender. Science? Questionable. But if it made you forget the damp ceiling and the fact
Your pillow was a sack of oats, then bless it. Long before the age of refrigerators humming in the kitchen and light-up freezer drawers filled with forgotten peas, medieval folks had to get creative to keep their food from turning into science experiments. Enter the marvel of passive preservation. Stone cooling shelves, also known as slab shelves, larders, or, to put it simply, that cold rock we put the cheese on. Here's how it worked. Thick slabs of stone, often slate or marble if you were fancy, were built into the shaded walls of homes, particularly on the north-facing side where the sun rarely touched. These stone shelves absorbed the naturally cooler temperatures of the earth and surrounding air, creating a sort of ambient cold zone. Basically a medieval version of a mini-fridge, but with less noise and more spiders. In cooler months, they kept milk, butter, meats, and whatever passed for leftovers from spoiling too quickly. Even in warmer weather, the stone remained cooler than the air thanks to its thermal mass, which is science speak for rock doesn't care how hot it is outside. No cords, no motors, no light bulb to shame you at 2 a.m. Just stone, shade, and sheer hope. Some homes even had entire stone pantries or cold rooms with thick walls and earthen floors. These were precursors to modern root cellars, and they were usually located as far away from the cooking fire as possible, because while medieval people loved hot soup, they didn't want it slowly heating their butter storage. In wealthier households, these shelves could be lined with damp cloths or porous jars filled with evaporating water to enhance the cooling effect, a clever use of physics without ever uttering the word evaporative. In poorer homes, it was just put the milk on the cold slab and hope it doesn't curdle before lunch. These days, if you twist an ankle or get stung by a bee, you reach for an ice pack, painkillers, or maybe a gel that promises cooling relief and delivers mild regret. But in the Middle Ages, when medicine often involved leeches or someone whispering Latin over a goat horn, people had a more accessible, less terrifying option: cabbage leaves. Yes, cabbage. The humble vegetable, known today for ruining school lunches and making boiled dishes smell like despair, once played a starring role in medieval first aid. Cabbage leaf dressings were used for everything from swelling and bruises to mastitis, joint pain, and the occasional plague-adjacent mystery rash. The logic? Simple. Cabbage is cooling, flexible, and slightly antimicrobial, a natural compress that came pre-wrapped in its own leafy packaging. You'd take a large, preferably cold cabbage leaf from the porous surface. It cooled the contents, kind of like a medieval refrigerator, but cheaper, quieter, and less likely to make your leftovers taste like Freon. Some even buried clay pots in cellars or shaded pits, where the Earth's steady underground temperature helped preserve food, drinks, and sometimes Grandma's emergency apple pie. They could also be heated near a fire, then used to slowly release warmth through the night. Clay bricks were placed in beds under cloaks, or even wrapped in wool and carried on wagons. The medieval equivalent of a hot water bottle, but earthier. And unlike modern batteries, these never exploded. At worst, they just cracked and quietly gave up. If you've ever cursed at a pan because your eggs decided to permanently fuse with it, you might appreciate Teflon. But if you lived in the Middle Ages, long before non-stick coatings and late-night infomercials, you relied on something far simpler and far more blister-inducing: friction glaze. Yes, medieval folks actually polished their cookware by hand to create a smooth, semi-resistant surface that helped reduce food sticking. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't perfect, but it works surprisingly well, especially if your expectations were already shattered by a lifetime of cabbage-based disappointments. Here's how it worked. Pottery, especially cookware, was usually made of coarse clay, which is about as non-stick as sandpaper. But by rubbing the still damp pots with smooth stones, bone tools, or even hard wood, they compressed the surface, aligning particles and sealing pores. This painstaking polishing created a subtle shine known as a burnished glaze. Imagine someone spending half a day massaging a soup pot like it owes them money. That's friction glaze.
Now, did this stop everything from sticking? No, this wasn't a miracle. It was medieval innovation, but it reduced food adhesion enough to make cleaning easier and stew less crusty. Some even coated their burnished pots with a thin layer of animal fat, then fired them to help seal the surface, a kind of prehistoric seasoning process. It also helped the pots last longer by making them more resistant to water and cracking. And for extra points, burnished pots looked nicer. In a time when most things were gray, wooden, or dying, a shiny cooking pot was basically the medieval equivalent of kitchen bling. Of course, the process was labor-intensive and likely gave many potters permanent shoulder problems, but it meant the difference between usable cookware and a vessel that turned porridge into plaster. Modern cookers might spend hundreds on titanium cookware or whatever the latest anti-stick miracle is, but medieval folks, they sat down, grabbed a rock, and just kept rubbing until the pot obeyed. Primitive? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. Long before GPS, Google Maps, and that one friend who swears he knows a shortcut and absolutely doesn't, people had to navigate using their ears, especially in fog or forests, or those charming medieval mornings when the mist was so thick you couldn't see your own cartwheel.
Each rushlight could burn anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how well it was soaked and how thick the rush was. If you needed more time, you lit another one. If you needed better light, you moved closer. And if your rushlight went out in a drafty room, well, welcome to the fun world of medieval darkness. Rushlights weren't just for lighting, though. They were timers, too. Need to boil something for half a rushlight's length? Done. Want to see how long it takes Gerald to return from the alehouse? Light one and count. They were cheap, fast to make, and surprisingly sustainable, assuming you didn't mind your house smelling faintly like fried pig and marsh water. Today, we store butter in refrigerators, plastic tubs, or inside artisanal wooden churns if you're really committed to pretending you live on a Victorian dairy farm. But in the Middle Ages, refrigeration wasn't an option. So naturally, someone looked at a swamp and thought, yeah, let's put the dairy product in there. And thus, bog butter was born. Bog butter is exactly what it sounds like. Butter, or sometimes lard, that was buried in a peat bog. Why a bog? Because despite being full of mud, insects, and things that probably hiss when disturbed, bogs are cold, oxygen-poor, and acidic. Nature's least inviting but surprisingly effective preservation chamber. People would take large quantities of butter, wrap them in cloth, bark, or even wooden barrels, and bury them deep in the peat, and not for a few hours. We're talking months, years, or in some cases, centuries. Archaeologists in Ireland have found bog butter over 3,000 years old. That's right, some ancient Celtic peasants' forgotten snack is now in a museum instead of on toast. The cold, airless bog kept bacteria and fungi from spoiling the butter, and the tannins in the peat helped prevent oxidation. The result? A weirdly preserved lump of dairy that, according to brave modern taste testers, smells like cheese, smoke, and earthy regret. Now, was this the go-to for your everyday kitchen butter? No. This was long-term survival mode storage, likely used for winter rations, tribute, or that cousin who always came uninvited in spring asking for food. Burying your butter in a bog also had the benefit of security. Want to keep thieves away? Hide your valuables in a freezing, ankle-deep mud pit. No one's digging for breakfast in that. If you're imagining medieval people living in cozy hobbit holes with rustic larders and shelves of neatly labeled preserves, think again. Food storage was often less Pinterest and more, please don't let this go rancid before winter kills us all. And one of the cleverest solutions, hollow trees. Yes, the original pantry that grew itself required zero carpentry and came with built-in camouflage. Hollow trees were surprisingly common across the medieval countryside. Whether naturally formed from age, lightning, rot, or overenthusiastic squirrels, these cavities became impromptu storage units for peasants, travelers, and anyone with something perishable and no better options. Need to stash cheese, dried meat, or apples away from the house? Shove it in a tree. Want to keep food from being stolen by the neighbor's goat, or worse, the neighbor? Tree. Traveling through the woods and need a cold place to store that questionable pheasant you found? Tree. The interior of a hollow tree provided shade, insulation, and natural concealment. The thick bark and enclosed cavity kept temperatures relatively stable and helped slow spoilage. Not ideal for long-term preservation, but perfect for short-term storage, especially in cooler months.
Some even lined the inside with leaves, moss, or bark to keep things dry and add a touch of that rustic medieval feng shui. Others placed food inside ceramic or leather containers before tucking them into the hollow, which at least gave the illusion that squirrels weren't licking your dinner. It wasn't just for food either. Hollow trees were also used to hide valuables, weapons, herbal remedies, and, in a pinch, small children during raids, not as a babysitting technique. A good tree could be the difference between starving and surviving, or at least the difference between cold cheese and suspiciously warm cheese. In the survival world, eating bark is usually code for things have gone very wrong. But in the Middle Ages, it was actually a legit survival food. Introducing bark bread, a medieval delicacy that says, I didn't starve, but I did chew a pine tree. During times of famine, which was often, peasants turned to the forest, not for game or mushrooms, too seasonal, too poisonous, but for tree bark, specifically the inner bark or cambium from pine, birch, or elm trees. This isn't the tough outer stuff, it's the soft, moist layer just beneath that was shaved off, dried, ground into flour, and mixed into bread dough. Was it delicious? No. Was it nutritious? Actually, surprisingly, yes. Bark contains fiber, trace minerals, and complex carbs. It kept people alive when grain stores were empty, taxes were due, and the cows had mysteriously stopped producing milk, probably unionizing. Most recipes mixed bark flour with whatever was available, acorns, nettles, actual flour if you were lucky, and baked it into flat, chewy loaves that looked like bread and tasted like forest. But when your choices were bark bread or becoming bark yourself, you chose carbs. Some people even toasted or roasted the bark before grinding it, which gave it a smoky flavor, or at least distracted from the fact that you were eating tree. And it wasn't just for peasants. During sieges and harsh winters, entire communities relied on bark-based food to survive, sometimes even taxing how much cambium you could harvest from communal forests. Too much bark collection, and the tree died. Not enough, and the villagers did. So if the world ends and you're standing in the woods, no food in sight, don't panic. Just look for a birch, channel your inner peasant, and remember, you can totally eat that. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, beauty was a daily devotion. Ancient Mesopotamians didn't just groom themselves, they ritualized it. For them, cleanliness and adornment were signs of civility, favor with the gods, and even political status. You weren't just putting on a face for the world, you were preparing yourself for divine observation. Let's start with the eyes. Thick black eyeliner wasn't born in Cleopatra's boudoir. It was thriving centuries earlier in Sumer. Both men and women painted dramatic lines using kohl, a powdered concoction of lead, copper, and antimony. While this might horrify modern dermatologists, they believed it protected them from evil spirits and, more practically, from the desert sun's glare. Their skincare routine would make modern influencers pores. Crushed semi-precious stones were mixed into oils to exfoliate and brighten the skin. Mud from the riverbanks, full of minerals, was smeared onto the body in thick, cooling layers. After it dried, it was gently scraped off, leaving the skin smooth and luminous. Yes, the first clay masks were less spa day and more ancient science. Hair removal was another ordeal. Using sharpened seashells or early tweezers, they plucked, scraped, or burned off body hair. Smoothness was equated with refinement and with godliness. The more polished your appearance, the closer you were to resembling divine perfection. Even their statues of gods and priestesses are hairless and immaculately styled with symmetrical features and wide painted eyes. And let's not forget the scent. Fragrant oils weren't just pleasant, they were powerful. Myrrh, frankincense, and cedar were infused into animal fats and applied to the skin like perfumes.
People believed these scents purified the body and pleased the gods. In royal courts, perfumed oils were so valuable that they were offered as tribute. Eyebrows tattooed. Permanent cosmetics weren't invented in the 20th century. They were already practiced in ancient temples. Women inked their brows using soot or natural dyes, creating bold arches that framed their faces dramatically. It was beauty with commitment. If you think today's beauty trends are extreme, let's talk about Cleopatra. Yes, the queen of eyeliner was more than just a seductress.
She was the poster girl for Greco-Roman beauty obsession. While her face graced coins, her influence reached into every apothecary and boudoir from Alexandria to Rome. And she wasn't alone. Roman women inherited Egypt's taste for luxury and then dialed it up to 11. Let's begin with the iconic milk bath. Cleopatra was rumored to bathe in donkey milk daily. Whether it was 500 donkeys or just a strong rumor, the truth is this. Lactic acid, found in sour milk, is a natural exfoliant. Romans copied this enthusiastically. Elite women bathed in milk, honey, and rose petals, believing it would smooth wrinkles and lighten the skin. And yes, it worked, just not for your wallet. Now to the face. Roman women desired pale, almost ghostly skin, a sign you were wealthy enough to avoid sunlight. Enter Cerussa, a face powder made of white lead, highly toxic, but hey, it gave that flawless matte finish. Women applied this daily, layering it on thick over the cheeks and forehead. Over time, it caused sores, hair loss, and in some cases, death. But looking like a goddess? Worth it. Rouge and lip stain were made from red ochre, crushed beetles, or mulberry juice. The more vivid your lips and cheeks, the more youthful and seductive you appeared. For eyeliner and eyebrows, soot mixed with animal fat did the trick. And if your eyebrows weren't naturally bold, no problem. Just draw them on, or better yet, tattoo them, just like in Mesopotamia. Hair was another battlefield. Roman women curled their hair into intricate styles using heated metal rods long before your grandmother's curling iron. They dyed it using herbs, ash, or even fermented leeches. Yes, seriously, for that fashionable blonde look. Wigs made from German slave hair were common among elite Roman women trying to show off their wealth and style. And perfume, an empire in itself. Romans were addicted to scent. Oils infused with saffron, cinnamon, and roses were rubbed into every crease of the body. Bathhouse smelled like botanical gardens dipped in musk. In ancient China, beauty
Wasn't flashy. It was philosophical. Where Rome chased glamour, the Chinese aesthetic prized balance, harmony, and inner key. But don't mistake subtlety for simplicity. The beauty rituals of dynastic China were just as rigorous, deeply spiritual, and sometimes shockingly intense. Start with the skin. Chinese beauty standards revered a pale, porcelain-like complexion, not because they feared the sun, but because fair skin symbolized nobility and leisure. Peasant women worked the fields under harsh sunlight. Aristocratic women, they stayed indoors and preserved their complexions like priceless scrolls. White lead powder, ground pearl, and even powdered rice were common ingredients. It wasn't just makeup, it was medicine too. Many formulas were designed by court physicians and believed to boost qi or prolong life. But the real star of ancient Chinese skincare was jade. Jade rollers, which TikTok made trendy again, were used centuries ago by Han Dynasty women. Cool to the touch and symbolically connected to immortality, jade tools were rolled across the face to promote circulation, reduce puffiness, and maintain youth. Even emperors were known to keep jade pillows, believing the stone would draw toxins from the skin while they slept. Eyebrows were serious business. Women shaped and painted their brows to reflect fashion and politics. In some dynasties, long, swooping brows were in vogue. In others, short and upward tilted lines dominated. Ink made from burnt willow or charcoal was applied with brushes made from rabbit fur. Some trends even encouraged removing natural brows altogether and redrawing them higher on the forehead, achieving a more heavenly appearance. Lips were tinted with a blend of cinnabar and animal fat, sometimes mixed with beeswax. Rouge made from safflower petals was dabbed on cheeks in small circles. And beauty marks? They weren't accidental. Some women painted tiny black dots near their lips or eyes, considered flirtatious symbols of charm and mystique.
Hair care was a daily ritual. Women used fermented rice water and camellia oil to wash and nourish their hair, which they often grew down to their knees. Elaborate updos held in place with jade pins and golden combs weren't just about style. They were a declaration of status, elegance, and cultural refinement. To the ancient Chinese, beauty wasn't loud or lethal. It was meditative, disciplined, and symbolic. It was artful restraint paired with quiet power, written not in words, but in the soft glow of powdered faces and the curve of a perfect brow. If ever there was a time when beauty killed, literally, it was the Renaissance. In the courts of Italy, England, and France, women weren't just enhancing their appearance, they were slowly poisoning themselves in pursuit of perfection. The goal? A glowing alabaster white face with blood-red lips and high, delicate brows. The method? A chemical cocktail that would terrify a modern dermatologist. Let's start with the most infamous, Venetian ceruse. This was a luxurious face paste made from white lead in vinegar. It gave a smooth, bone-white finish, hiding blemishes and wrinkles. Queen Elizabeth I wore it religiously. Under candlelight, it gave a luminous glow that made skin look porcelain. But the downside? Skin corrosion, paralysis, tooth decay, and eventually, death. It was the Renaissance equivalent of a slow-drip time bomb. But wait, there's arsenic too. For women who wanted to brighten their complexion or lighten freckles, arsenic wafers were sold as miracle pills. Swallowing small doses supposedly gave the skin a translucent look. It also caused vomiting, kidney damage, and internal bleeding. But beauty waits for no one, not even your liver. Eyebrows were plucked into thin arches or removed entirely. A high, rounded forehead was fashionable, so women sometimes shaved their hairlines an inch or two to create the illusion of a larger brain, and therefore higher virtue. Balding was rebranded as high status.
Cheek color came from crushed berries, cocoa bugs, or vermilion. Lips were painted with similar mixes. Some women used mercury-based red dyes, which added a seductive pop of color and irreversible nerve damage. Flushed cheeks were not just pretty, they indicated youth and vitality, something aristocrats cherished in an era of short lifespans. And the smell. Cloying fragrances made from ambergris, musk, and civet were worn not just for allure, but to mask the unwashed reality beneath layers of toxic cosmetics. After all, bathing was still viewed with suspicion in many parts of Europe. Hair. Golden locks were ideal, especially in Italy. Women bleached their hair using mixtures of sulfur, soda, and lemon juice, then sat in the sun wearing wide-brimmed hats with the tops cut out to expose only their hair. It worked, but also fried their scalps. Long before modern skincare touted natural as a buzzword, ancient India had already written the manual. And it wasn't just skincare, it was Ayurveda, the science of life. Indian beauty rituals weren't isolated routines. They were extensions of spiritual wellness, diet, and inner balance. Beauty was the outer mirror of your doshas, your elemental energies. Let's start with the bath. The ritual of cleansing was sacred. Women of the Vedic period bathed in turmeric-infused water or milk, followed by exfoliation with uptan, a paste of chickpea flour, sandalwood, turmeric, milk, and rose water. It brightened the skin, slowed aging, and purified energy. No parabens, no microplastics, just ingredients from the kitchen that doubled as sacred medicine. Hair was a crowning glory. Coconut oil, amla, Indian gooseberry, and hibiscus were infused into warm oils, massaged into the scalp to stimulate growth, calm the mind, and ward off premature gray. Thick, waist-length hair wasn't just an aesthetic. It was a marker of vitality and femininity. Hair oiling sessions were communal, intimate, and meditative. Kajal, the black eyeliner still used across India today, had spiritual roots. Made from soot and ghee, it was believed to protect from the evil eye. Mothers would apply it not just to themselves, but to their babies as a shield against negative forces. But it also framed the eyes beautifully, giving them the depth of ancient poetry. Fragrance. Entire cities like Kannauj became famous for distilling attars, perfumes made from flowers like jasmine, rose, and vetiver. These oils were rubbed onto the skin, used in hair, and even mixed into bath water. Their purpose wasn't just seduction, but spiritual clarity. Scents helped align the senses with the divine.
Lip and cheek tints came from beetroot, saffron, and crushed rose petals. And teeth cleaned with neem sticks and charcoal long before plastic toothbrushes arrived. Even dental hygiene was a ritual, timed with moon cycles and linked to doshic balance. Perhaps most unique was mehndi, henna. Used to decorate hands and feet, especially during weddings, henna wasn't just cosmetic. It cooled the body, lowered stress, and signified joy, fertility, and transformation. Every swirl in the design told a story.
The ancient Greeks adored beauty, but not in the flashy, gilded sense of later empires. For them, beauty was moral. Physical perfection reflected a virtuous soul. A sculpted body or symmetrical face wasn't just attractive. It was a sign of inner harmony, intelligence, and divine favor. So it's no surprise that grooming in classical Greece was practically a civic duty. Let's begin with the skin. Like the Romans, Greeks idolized pale complexions. A white face meant leisure and nobility. A tanned face meant you worked outside, which was for slaves and peasants. To achieve this ghostly ideal, Greek women used powders made from white lead, again, chalk, or crushed seashells. These powders weren't subtle. In fact, some women layered them so thickly that they cracked when they smiled. But hey, beauty is sacrifice. Red lips and cheeks came from mulberries, red iron oxide, or even wine dregs. The richer the red, the more desirable the look. However, application had to be light. Heavy makeup was frowned upon. A modest flush meant good health and chastity. Too much that was associated with prostitutes known as heter, who famously used richer rouge and elaborate cosmetics to entertain philosophers and statesmen alike. Hair care was no afterthought. Greek women prized long, wavy hair, often styled in braids, buns, or knots, and held together with ivory or bronze pins. To lighten their hair, they rubbed in vinegar, lemon juice, and sometimes used ashes. Blonde hair especially was idealized as divine and foreign. Think Helen of Troy. Wigs and hairpieces made from enslaved northern women weren't uncommon among the elite. Eyebrows were key. A single continuous brow, yes, a unibrow, was a sign of purity and intelligence. Women who weren't naturally blessed would fake it, using powdered antimony or soot. Some even glued goat hair between their brows, all for that soft, scholarly look. Perfumes were blended with care, using olive oil as a base, mixed with herbs like marjoram, thyme, and iris root. They were applied after bathing, which the Greeks did obsessively, often in public
Baths. Cleanliness was next to godliness, literally. In the jungles and highlands of Mesoamerica, beauty wasn't soft, and it definitely wasn't subtle. For the Aztec and Mayan civilizations, beauty was bold, a physical badge of identity, power, and sacred duty. The ideal body was crafted, carved, and sometimes painfully altered, all in service of the gods and societal status. Let's start with the most intense cranial modification. Among both the Mayans and Aztecs, shaping a baby's skull was seen as an enhancement. From infancy, wooden boards were gently but firmly bound to a child's head to elongate the skull into a sloped, almost cone-like shape. It was a sign of nobility, intelligence, and beauty. The longer and smoother the forehead, the higher your social standing. Next up, dental decoration. Forget whitening strips. Mayan elites embedded jade, turquoise, and even hematite into their teeth. Tiny holes were drilled with obsidian tools, and precious stones were glued in with natural resins. The sparkle when they smiled? Literal. The pain tolerance? Astronomical. Filed teeth were also fashionable, shaped into sharp points or symmetrical patterns to mimic animal traits, suggesting strength or divine connection. Skin and face painting played a major role in daily life and ritual. Aztec women often wore red and yellow pigments on their cheeks, while both men and women used black paint for ceremonies. The colors weren't random, they had meaning. Red was for life and fertility. Black often signified war or devotion. Some paints were made from crushed insects, like cochineal, giving a vibrant crimson hue. Piercings and tattoos were spiritual commitments. Ear, nose, and lip piercings were common,
often adorned with jade or bone jewelry. Tattoos created with thorns and ink displayed one's family lineage, religious role, or even battlefield honors. These weren't subtle accessories, they were declarations of loyalty to gods like Quetzalcoatl or Ixchel. Even crossed eyes were considered attractive among the Maya. Mothers dangled beads in front of their infants' noses, training them to look inward until their eyes misaligned. This wasn't seen as a defect, but as a sign of mystical insight. Across the vast and varied landscapes of ancient Africa, beauty was as diverse as the terrain itself. From the lush Nile Valley to the savannas of Nubia and the trade cities of West Africa, beauty rituals were both practical and profoundly symbolic. Adornment wasn't just a matter of style. It was a statement of identity, status, and even cosmic alignment. Let's begin. In ancient Egypt, where beauty was practically a science, both men and women wore kohl around their eyes, not just for allure, but as protection. The black pigment, made from galena or lead sulfide, reduced sun glare and warded off infections. The dramatic lines extended beyond the lids, creating the famous almond-eyed look of Egyptian art. Eyes weren't just mirrors of the soul, they were sacred instruments, channels to the divine. Perfume was a luxury and a necessity.
Egyptians loved scent so much that they created perfume cones, wax cones infused with myrrh, cinnamon, and lotus oil that were worn on the head during ceremonies. As the cone melted in the heat, it released fragrance, coating the hair and body. Daily hygiene included scented oils after bathing, often applied with stone or alabaster jars that were art pieces in themselves. Skincare was rooted in both beauty and climate survival. Palm oil, shea butter, and castor oil were used to protect the skin from harsh sun and dryness. These oils weren't just moisturizing, they were medicinal. Mixed with herbs, they healed wounds, soothed rashes, and preserved the skin's glow. Body scrubs were made from sand or crushed seeds, keeping skin exfoliated and clean long before loofahs were invented. In Nubia, hairstyles were central to identity. Elaborate braids and shaved patterns told stories of tribe, age, and marital status. Hair was often dyed with henna or decorated with beads, shells, and gold threads. A towering styled coif was more than fashionable. It was regal. Further west, in ancient Yoruba or Sanghay territories, body painting using indigo and ochre pigments played a role in rituals and celebrations. Tribal markings, either scarified or painted, were not seen as blemishes, but beauty enhancements and markers of strength and heritage. Beauty has always demanded something in return: time, effort, money. But in the ancient world, it could also demand your health, your sanity, and even your life. Across civilizations, the pursuit of perfection often crossed into dangerous territory. While these rituals were admired and even worshipped, they sometimes left scars far deeper than the cosmetic. We've already seen the chilling ingredients: lead, arsenic, mercury, and crushed insects, all used in makeup and skincare. What these substances had in common was toxicity. Lead face powders used in Rome, Greece, and later Renaissance Europe caused hair loss, muscle paralysis, and slow organ failure. And yet, the paler your skin, the higher your desirability.
Poison wrapped in a compliment. In ancient China, women of the elite class once bound their feet from an early age in pursuit of the so-called lotus foot, an ideal that symbolized grace and obedience. Though foot binding became more dominant during later dynasties, early iterations of similar practices already existed. The result was permanent deformity. But it wasn't considered cruelty, it was considered beauty. Let's not forget the ritualized cane of tattoos, piercings, and body modifications. For the Maya and Aztecs, inserting jade into your teeth or reshaping your skull was seen as a mark of honor. But the risk of infection, pain, and permanent damage was high. Likewise, in ancient African and Middle Eastern cultures, scarification was a sign of strength and beauty, but involved cutting intricate patterns into the skin, often without antiseptics.
Even perfumes could be dangerous. In Egypt, perfume cones often included ingredients like cinnamon oil, which in high concentrations can burn the skin. And since bathing with water was a luxury, heavy oils could trap dirt and bacteria, leading to infections. Cosmetics and treatments weren't regulated or standardized. One person's beauty secret was another's slow demise. And since many rituals were passed down by word of mouth or inscribed in secretive texts, misinformation was as common as vanity itself. In every culture, the pursuit of beauty reflected the values of the time: power, divinity, nobility, virtue. But the cost? It was often paid in silence. The scars were hidden beneath powders, perfumes, and elaborate hairstyles. Long before monopoly ruined family dinners, the people of ancient Mesopotamia were already obsessed with board games, especially one called the Royal Game of Ur. Discovered in the 1920s by British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in the Royal Cemetery of Ur, this game dates back over 4,500 years. But it wasn't just some idle diversion tucked away in a dusty corner. It was sacred, symbolic, possibly even cosmic. The game's board itself is a masterpiece, a small rectangular board decorated with intricate designs, typically made of wood, ivory, or shell.
Rancid before winter kills us all. And one of the cleverest solutions, hollow trees. Yes, the original pantry that grew itself required zero carpentry and came with built-in camouflage. Hollow trees were surprisingly common across the medieval countryside. Whether naturally formed from age, lightning, rot, or overenthusiastic squirrels, these cavities became impromptu storage units for peasants, travelers, and anyone with something perishable and no better options. Need to stash cheese, dried meat, or apples away from the house? Shove it in the tree. Want to keep food from being stolen by the neighbor's goat, or worse, the neighbor? Tree. Traveling through the woods and need a cold place to store that questionable pheasant you found? Tree. The interior of a hollow tree provided shade, insulation, and natural concealment. The thick bark and enclosed cavity kept temperatures relatively stable and helped slow spoilage. Not ideal for long-term preservation, but perfect for short-term storage, especially in cooler months. Some even lined the inside with leaves, moss, or bark to keep things dry and add a touch of that rustic medieval feng shui. Others placed food inside ceramic or leather containers before tucking them into the hollow, which at least gave the illusion that squirrels weren't licking your dinner. It wasn't just for food either. Hollow trees were also used to hide valuables, weapons, herbal remedies, and, in a pinch, small children during raids. Not as a babysitting technique. A good tree could be the difference between starving and surviving, or at least the difference between cold cheese and suspiciously warm cheese. In the survival world, eating bark is usually code for things have gone very wrong, but in the Middle Ages, it was actually a legit survival food. Introducing bark bread, a medieval delicacy that says, I didn't starve, but I did chew a pine tree. During times of famine, which was often, peasants turned to the forest, not for game or mushrooms, too seasonal, too poisonous, but for tree bark, specifically the inner bark or cambium from pine, birch, or elm trees. This isn't the tough outer stuff, it's the soft, moist layer just beneath that was shaved off, dried, ground into flour, and mixed into bread dough. Was it delicious? No. Was it nutritious? Actually, surprisingly, yes. Bark contains fiber, trace minerals, and complex carbs. It kept people alive when grain stores were empty, taxes were due, and the cows had mysteriously stopped producing milk, probably unionizing. Most recipes mixed bark flour with whatever was available. Acorns, nettles,
A household diversion. It was now a symbolic enactment of the soul's voyage through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Certain squares on the board came to represent key stages of that journey: rebirth, judgment, peril, purification. Each turn of the game wasn't just a gamble. It was an invocation of divine will. The iconography around Senate became increasingly mystical. Some boards were inscribed with hieroglyphs representing protective deities or spells. Square 26, for example, often symbolized the house of rebirth, while Square 27 might be the house of happiness. Landing there could mean divine protection, while other squares spelled delay or even danger.
The board became a microcosm of the afterlife, a spiritual obstacle course laid out in cedar and paint. Senet was also closely tied to the goddess Mahat, the embodiment of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Playing Senet well was the symbolic rehearsal for navigating the trials of the afterlife, where the soul would be weighed against the feather of Mahat. Win the game, and you might win immortality. Lose, let's just say you'd better hope someone packed extra amulets in your tomb. So while Senet may look like an ancient version of backgammon, it was much more. Part game, part theology, part guidebook to the netherworld. In Egypt, you didn't just play Senet, you prayed through it. To the untrained eye, knucklebones looked like child's play, just a handful of oddly shaped bones tossed in the air. But in ancient Greece, it was far more than a simple pastime. It was a game of skill, chance, flirtation, and even divine symbolism. Whether in bustling Athenian marketplaces or quiet temple courtyards, knucklebones clattered across stone floors, echoing laughter, rivalry, and ritual. The game was originally played using the small ankle bones of sheep or goats, known as astragaloi. Unlike modern dice, these four-sided bones didn't roll in uniform patterns, making each throw unpredictable. Players tossed them into the air and tried to catch them on the back of their
hand, or land them, in certain positions to score points. The rules varied by region and era, but the thrill was universal. It wasn't just kids who played. Adults, particularly women, adored it. Greek vases and sculptures often show young girls playing knucklebones in elegant robes, their faces full of concentration. For many, it was a game of elegance and dexterity. A kind of ancient fidget spinner meets social ritual. In fact, it was sometimes used as a courtship display, where a graceful throw might catch the eye of a passing suitor. But there was also something deeper. The astragaloi were often linked to fate and the gods. Each side of the bone had a name and a numerical value, which made them ideal for both gaming and divination. A good throw might be interpreted as a sign from the gods, perhaps even a message from Apollo or Hermes. And if you threw 4 of the same side, that was the coveted Venus throw, a win so perfect it was said to be touched by divine favor. The game also had strong ties to death and the afterlife. Knucklebones were often placed in graves as toys or tools for divination in the next world. Some believed spirits could play through them, or that they helped the dead predict the future. Eventually, the game evolved. Greeks began casting knucklebones made of bronze, glass, and ivory. But the core appeal remained. It was easy to learn, hard to master, and steeped in mystique. In Greece, knucklebones were more than a game. They were flirtation, fate, and fun, all rolled into a single toss. If chess is war on a board, then ludus latrinulum was Rome's declaration of battle. This ancient Roman game, often shortened to latrinuli, or the game of little soldiers, wasn't just a way to pass time in a villa courtyard. It was an intellectual sparring match, a brainy rehearsal for real-world conflict. To play it well was to think like a general. The exact rules of ludus latrinorum have been lost to time, but enough fragments, wooden boards, clay pieces, and literary references remain to paint a compelling picture. Played on a grid, often 8-8 or 9-8 10 squares, each player controlled an army of small uniform pieces called latrones, or mercenaries. The objective? Outmaneuver your opponent and capture their pieces by surrounding them. No dice, no luck, just cunning. What made it thrilling was its subtlety. This wasn't a race game like Tali or Set. It was tactical, demanding foresight and psychological warfare. Players would bait, feint, and trap, just like in actual military campaigns. Roman authors like Varro and Ovid mention it as a pastime favored by both men and women,
Soldiers and statesmen. Some saw it as a test of character. Others just liked humiliating their friends in front of a crowd. Interestingly, the game wasn't confined to the elite. Latruni boards have been found scratched into stones, floors, and even rooftops across the Roman Empire, from Britain to Egypt. Soldiers played it while stationed on the frontier.
Merchants played it between negotiations. It transcended class and culture, offering both escape and strategic training. The pieces themselves varied. Simple pebbles, carved ivory tokens, or glass counters. Some boards featured special squares, possibly fortresses or thrones where key captures could occur. Scholars debate whether a single king piece existed in some versions, but regardless, the game rewarded ruthless logic over brute strength. Roman poets often used the game as a metaphor. Losing a piece was like losing favor in court, getting surrounded like political betrayal. Even the gods were said to play versions of it, suggesting that strategy was not just human, but divine. Ludus Lunintrunculorum may be extinct, but its spirit survives in modern games like chess and checkers. It was Rome's intellectual blood sport, a game where victory meant more than bragging rights. It meant superiority of mind. Before Senate reigned supreme in ancient Egypt, there was Mayhen, a mysterious spiral-shaped board game named after a protective serpent god. Mayhen wasn't just a game. It was a riddle wrapped in mythology, strategy, and ceremony. While the exact rules have vanished into the sands of time, the surviving boards and game pieces suggest that Mayhen was more than just recreation. It was cosmic symbolism in motion. The board itself was striking, a coiled serpent, its body segmented into rectangular spaces spiraling inward toward the head. The serpent Mayhen was believed to protect the sun god Ra during his nightly journey through the underworld. So in essence, each game was a reenactment of a divine voyage, players navigating the coils of danger, transformation, and rebirth. The pieces discovered alongside Mayhen boards include small lion-shaped tokens and round marbles or spheres. Scholars believe each player controlled a set of marbles that traveled through the serpent's body, possibly escorted or threatened by the lion figures. The lions may have acted as guardians, obstacles, or even competitive attackers. Its rapid disappearance popular during the Old Kingdom, around 2600 to 2300 BCE, it abruptly vanished from records and archaeological finds by the Middle Kingdom. Why? No one knows. Some theorize that its religious associations fell out of favor. Others believe it was simply overshadowed by Senate's growing role in funerary rites. Either way, Mayhen became a relic, leaving behind only beautiful serpent-shaped boards and silent lion-headed pieces. Its presence outside Egypt is equally intriguing. Similar spiral boards have been found in Cyprus and the Levant, suggesting the game, or at least its imagery, traveled through trade or conquest. Did it retain its symbolic meaning in foreign lands, or was it stripped of myth and reduced to a puzzle? The evidence doesn't say, but the mystery only adds to Mayhen's allure. In the end, Mayhen was more than a pastime. It was a walk along the divine spine of a serpent, a metaphor for protection, risk, and the eternal cycle of life and death. To play it was to enter a spiral, one where each move echoed with myth. Long before the Vikings wrote sagas or carved runestones, they played Tafel, a family of asymmetric board games that mirrored their brutal world of raids, sieges, and survival. From frozen longhouses in Norway to trading ports in Ireland, Tafel games were spread across the North world, sharpening minds as much as swords. These were not gentle pastimes. Tafel was warfare distilled into strategy, deception, and calculated risk. The most famous version is Hefetafel, or King's Table, played on a square grid that varied in size, most commonly 11-11 or 13-13. The asymmetry is the game's signature. One player commands a king and a small group of defenders in the center of the board. The other controls a larger army of attackers on the edges. The king's goal, escape to a corner square. The attacker's goal, capture the king by surrounding him on all four sides. There are no dice, no luck, only logic, planning, and brute positional play. And just like in Viking raids, the odds are not even.